Okay, we're live.
Hello, namaste. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to all the panelists and participants participating in this important side event of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And also to all those participants who are following us on the Facebook and YouTube Live. This webinar titled Are Indigenous Voices Being Heard is jointly organized by Indigenous Media Caucus, WACC, and Cultural Survival. My name is Dev Kumar Sunwar. I am moderating this event today. And I am the coordinator of Indigenous Media Caucus and the coordinator of Cultural Survival's Asia program and the chairperson of Indigenous Television in Nepal. Before I go into the session further, I would like to inform you that the translation is available in Spanish and English. Please select the language that you prefer, clicking the map of the globe right side below on your screen. If you have any questions, you can put in the chat box, and also you can participate later on after the end of the presentations. To introduce briefly about the organizers, as I say, the Indigenous Media Caucus, which is a network of Indigenous journalists and media practitioners from around the world. And it was formed in the year 2016 at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which basically makes a consolidated advocacy effort at the UN through UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples and other relevant forums at the UN and like-minded international forums. Similarly, the World Association for Christian Communications, in short, which is known as WACC, is a non-governmental organization which is based in Boston, which is based in Canada, sorry, and which builds on a communication rights in order to promote the social justice. Another organizations, which is Cultural Survival. Cultural Survival is Indigenous-led nonprofit organizations, which is based in Boston, that advocates for the Indigenous people's right to self-determinations, and it supports in advancement of Indigenous people's right and culture worldwide, and it has been doing so for the last 50 years. WACC, together with Cultural Survival, through Indigenous Media Caucus, supporting Indigenous community radios and Indigenous journalists, as well as communicators, for empowering them, as well as for bringing Indigenous journalists and media practitioners in international forums like this, and also conducting a study. Today's webinar is also based on the study, which is commissioned jointly by Caucus, WACC, and Cultural Survival. And this study basically highlights the role that Indigenous media, especially Indigenous community radio, play in strengthening and maintaining Indigenous languages. And it also notes the systematic discrimination that the Indigenous media face within state policies and state laws. And in many countries, the media, which is valuable only in dominant languages, non-Indigenous languages, to the exclusion of Indigenous languages, making inaccessible to and hampering Indigenous people's right to information in Indigenous languages. At the same time, or meanwhile, globally, the Indigenous peoples, they are also making an effort, or incredible effort, to establish the media in their own languages, from themselves by themselves and for themselves, as guaranteed by the UNDRIP Article 16. So with this background, I would like to call upon our first panelist, Jose Manuel Ramos. Jose Manuel is a lecturer at the Pueblo American University in Ibero American University in Puebla, Mexico, and he has conducted research and published extensively on indigenous radio and indigenous communications. And he was the researcher for the study jointly conducted by Indigenous Media Caucus, WACC, and Cultural Survival, titled "Are Indigenous Voices Being Heard?" So I would like to request him to present a brief summary of the findings of the study and to what extent the indigenous people's voices are being heard. Señor José Manuel, please, the floor is yours.
Le doy la palabra, señor José Manuel.
Sí, muchas gracias. Buenos días a todas, a todos. Buenas tardes en otras partes del mundo. Pues voy a presentar de manera muy breve algunas ideas importantes recogidas a partir del estudio que realizamos. Voy a compartir la pantalla y para hacerlo lo más breve posible. Bueno, pues este era el título inicial del estudio. Están siendo escuchadas las voces indígenas. Es un estudio que hicimos en 19 países. Bueno, como toda investigación, teníamos una pregunta importante a contestar, que era esta: ¿cuáles eran los avances que se habían logrado hasta 2019, que se cerró el estudio, por los pueblos indígenas en avances al ejercicio al derecho a establecer sus propios medios de información, particularmente la radio, en sus propios idiomas, tal como lo mandata el artículo 16. Nosotros hicimos una selección de 19 países en donde procuramos que estuvieran al menos representados con un país, pues los distintos continentes y regiones del mundo. Bueno, es evidente que hay algunos continentes que no están cabalmente representados. Por ejemplo, en Asia, pues nos falta lo que sería África, Asia Central, lo mismo en África, pero pues hay una muestra pues más o menos que nos da un panorama. Así luciría los países que revisamos, así se vería en un mapa. Bueno, el estudio se basa en que nosotros hicimos reportes individuales por cada país. De hecho, el grueso del estudio son cada uno de los 19 reportes que se hicieron por país. En cada país abordamos, en cada reporte tenemos estos 4 puntos principales. En primer lugar, el reporte da un panorama general de contexto sobre la situación de los pueblos indígenas en ese país. Después, quisimos revisar cuál era el reconocimiento que se daba a los derechos indígenas, por lo menos a nivel de las leyes, de la constitución política, y si los países se habían adherido a la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Indígenas y al Convenio 169 de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo para Pueblos Indígenas y Tribales. Bueno, posteriormente en cada reporte se analiza la situación de la radio comunitaria en general. ¿Cuál es el marco institucional? ¿Cuál es el marco legal de la radio comunitaria en general? Para después pasar a cuál es la situación de la radio comunitaria indígena. Esto nos lleva también a plantear de manera muy breve una definición que tuvimos para considerar qué radios estudiamos. Nosotros quisimos enfocarnos en las radios manejadas por los pueblos indígenas, iniciativas de base que, digamos, estuvieran cumpliendo con este mandato del artículo 16 de ser medios propios. Bien. Respecto del, voy a concentrarme por las características de esta reunión en estos aspectos institucionales, legales. Entonces, bueno, vimos que todos los países que revisamos, excepto Kenia, se habían adherido a la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Indígenas. Y por lo que toca al Convenio 169 de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, todos los países de América Latina habían firmado este convenio, exceptuando El Salvador. Y del resto de los países, solo Nepal se ha adherido a la Convención 169. Por lo que toca a cómo son reconocidos los derechos de los pueblos en las constituciones, tomamos a la Constitución como la ley suprema de un país y solamente ahí nos concentramos. Es posible que haya leyes secundarias a la Constitución que reconocen o algunas que niegan los derechos, pero a nivel secundario. Entonces, en la Constitución nosotros pudimos encontrar hacer tres grupos de países. Aquellos países en donde hay un reconocimiento explícito a los derechos indígenas. Estos países son Bolivia, Colombia, México, Ecuador, Nicaragua y en cierto modo Guatemala. Todos son países en América Latina. La mayoría de los otros países hay un reconocimiento a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, pero ese reconocimiento es limitado, es de carácter proteccionista, tutelar. Entonces tenemos ahí a El Salvador, Honduras, Perú, Ghana, Kenia, Nepal e India. Es preciso mencionar que hay algunos países cuyas constituciones están en un constante, bueno, en un proceso de cambio notorio, y sería la de Sudáfrica, Namibia, Canadá y Australia. Y hay dos países de los que revisamos que los pueblos indígenas no tienen ningún reconocimiento, simplemente como si no existieran, que son Tailandia y Filipinas. Bueno, por lo que toca a la radio comunitaria y el estatus legal, el estatus institucional de la radio comunitaria, encontramos que en realidad todos los países, con estas excepciones, reconocen a la radio comunitaria, a este tercer sector en la radiodifusión, que no es ni el público ni el privado. Entonces tenemos a Guatemala, Nicaragua, Filipinas y Nepal, en donde no se reconoce a la radio comunitaria. Evidentemente hay una gran diversidad en la manera de entender a la radio comunitaria. Algunos países consideran radio comunitaria a las radios de universidades, de escuelas, a las radios religiosas, en otros países no. En fin, esto es una diversidad, pero la figura de radio comunitaria existe. Y también vamos a ver que hay algunos países en donde no se... que los países, las iniciativas tienen que transmitir de manera ilegal, transmiten sin una licencia. Bueno, pasamos ahora al punto de la radio comunitaria indígena. Aquellos países en donde existe un estatus específico de la radio indígena, no subsumido a la radio comunitaria, sino con una personalidad propia. Estos países son, desde luego, Australia, Canadá, en donde la radio comunitaria indígena tiene un gran vigor, tiene ya una trayectoria muy notable, y los otros países, Bolivia, México, Ecuador y Colombia, son países en los que se reconoce a la radio indígena. Esto nos parece que es importante porque los pueblos han hecho esfuerzos por una modalidad propia. No es simplemente una radio comunitaria, son radios indígenas, medios indígenas. Bueno, lo que podemos ver es que, para dar una idea general, es que la radio comunitaria indígena, como un movimiento visible, pues tiene sus antecedentes indudables en Canadá y Australia, ya desde los años 80, quizás desde antes del siglo pasado. En América Latina, las radios indígenas surgen a finales del siglo pasado, mientras que en África y en Asia aparecen hasta este siglo, pero sobre todo hacia la última década, de 2010 para acá, hemos visto este movimiento como se va fortificando. Bueno, aquí tenemos un cuadro que nos dice el número de radios comunitarias indígenas que consideramos en el estudio. Evidentemente, pues son números relativos, no hay que tomarlos al pie de la letra, porque pues es difícil determinar cuáles son radios verdaderamente de base manejadas por los pueblos indígenas. Y además hay países como México, como Guatemala, como otros países en donde las radios transmiten sin licencia, de modo que no hay una documentación que nos permitiera precisar cuántas radios existen. Entonces aquí vemos algunas cosas que pues podríamos comentar. Por ejemplo, en Sudáfrica consideramos que no habría ninguna radio comunitaria manejada totalmente por los pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, por ejemplo, en Sudáfrica hay una gran actividad en medios indígenas, radio indígena, pero que transmiten en radios comunitarias en general, solo dedican un tiempo delimitado a la radio indígena, a los idiomas indígenas, y así hay una diversidad de situaciones, pero aquí quisimos concentrar las radios que son realmente operadas por los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, como vemos, pues en América Latina, bueno, en los países considerados hay cierto desarrollo, bueno, pues ahí están los datos. Australia y Canadá son países donde los medios indígenas tienen una gran consolidación. Bueno, en el estudio nosotros pudimos encontrar cuáles son los temas, cuáles son las problemáticas que abordan estas radios, digamos las que les dan su razón de ser y pues en esto enfatizan su trabajo. Es una lista pues un poco larga, creada por adición. Algunas radios enfatizan más un tema que otro, pero en conjunto este es el panorama que tenemos. Evidentemente, este estudio se realizó antes de que la pandemia de COVID se extendiera de esta manera, pero las radios comunitarias han tenido un papel fundamental en esta situación de pandemia. Solamente para cerrar, nosotros hicimos algunas reflexiones en el estudio para señalar algunos puntos que pudieran considerarse en las próximas agendas que contemplaran el desarrollo de la radio indígena. Entonces, tenemos estos 5 ideas que voy a mencionar brevemente. Bueno, es preciso que se trabaje en el reconocimiento legal, el reconocimiento institucional de esta propia personalidad de los medios indígenas. Bueno, en segundo lugar, pensamos que las radios, los medios indígenas, forman parte de un proyecto político más amplio y que hay que tener conciencia de eso. No es el medio actuando por sí solo, sino es parte de una movilización en favor de los derechos indígenas. Después, que es necesario que las radios, los medios indígenas avancen hacia una autonomía desde el punto de vista tecnológico, desde el punto de vista financiero y desde el punto de vista de tomar sus propias decisiones. Después señalamos que es necesario avanzar en un pensamiento decolonial, de cambiar los paradigmas que reproducen el esquema colonial con el que hemos crecido pues, en los últimos siglos y trascender este pensamiento de colonial. Finalmente, que las radios pues deberían estar apuntalando, contribuyendo a la autodeterminación de los pueblos indígenas y a la conquista de su soberanía en todos los planos. Bueno, espero no haberme excedido en el tiempo y estas son unas ideas muy puntuales acerca del estudio realizado. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Señor José Manuel, for presenting the achievements, obstacles, and setbacks in implementing the Indigenous people's right to establish media, moreover, highlighting the status of Indigenous broadcasting in 19 different countries. Now, I would like to bring you the grassroots experiences, mainly the realization of Indigenous peoples' rights to own a media, the experiences from Africa. So to present the African experiences, I would like to call upon Miriam Dicker. She is a descendant from both KhoiSan ancestors. As a media practitioner, the focus of her work is human rights, with the strong bias towards the rights of Indigenous KhoiSan people in South Africa and beyond. And for more than 10 years, she has been working with the Valley FM, and she, together with her colleagues, use community media to amplify the voices of KhoiSan Indigenous communities, to promote the discussions, debates towards the society that is more informed, embracing, and respectful of the situation of Indigenous peoples in South Africa. So, Marianne, the floor is yours.
Good day, everybody, and good day for this opportunity. Working with community radio focusing on Indigenous issues had its own challenges in South Africa. But let us focus on what mainstream media and the impact of the lack of effective representation of KhoiSan communities in mainstream media has on the psyche of South Africa, and also how it reflects on a country that is far behind in terms of implementing UNDRIP as it should be. If we look at the impact of mass media, and especially now, you've mentioned the changes in South Africa, changes in terms of legislation, actually recognizing KhoiSan leaders. The KhoiSan, the traditional KhoiSan Leaders Act has just been implemented 1st of April 2021. If we look at coverage of that very pivotal moment in the history of Indigenous people in South Africa, one would think that it would be a moment of pride and a moment where KhoiSan leaders would say, yes, we have been heard. But that has not been the case, because as we see the coverage of the legislation, policy, initiatives leading up to the enactment of the law, KhoiSan leaders had opportunities to present their positions to government. What has been reported in mainstream media has mainly been those voices of a small number, the minority in National KhoiSan Leaders Council, in favor of government positions. So the majority of KhoiSan leaders who were opposing this legislation, who have been against the impact the legislation would have, the inequality that would have been exacerbated for KhoiSan Indigenous peoples, has simply been ignored. So the past few months, we would have seen even the president, we would have seen broadcast media, TV, and mainstream media focusing solely on the government position, and those voices, the minority KhoiSan leaders, actually aligned with the government position. The same has happened with other legislation that has been passed over the last 2 years. We look at the Rooibos agreement, where Rooibos tea and the patent rights and the rights of Indigenous people to be actually to benefit from the Indigenous knowledge had a long struggle to actually say, yes, it is just rightfully so that Indigenous people should benefit. So coming to the implementation of an agreement, that agreement is hailed by everybody in mainstream media as something to be celebrated. But when one look at the dissenting voices, the voices that is saying, please look at what is actually happening, look at the impact that this agreement is not actually in favor of the Khoi and the San communities on the ground. Those voices are being silent. And I think it's mainly for two reasons. Firstly, it is these opposed leaders, the Khoi and San leaders, are seen as they should not be involved in matters that does not concern them. And they should be concerned mainly with with aligning themselves with a government position if they want to be heard, if they want to be compensated, if they want to be part of government struggles. So the community's voices are not heard. And then there's also the way that media practitioners portray KhoiSan activists and communities. We look at the colonialist past, and we look at the perceptions that firstly, they are not sophisticated enough to have their own views or to put forward their views, that should they be dressed in traditional gear, it is basically a sign that they are still uncivilized and that it's not acceptable. That should they demand to be heard in their own languages, they are not part of the broader society where there are other mainstream languages. And the interviews are very condescending, and in many cases it is putting KhoiSan leaders in a very bad light. And one would actually say maybe deliberately so, because whose agenda does the mass media actually advance? And when we look at mass media, the fact that the mass media, that KhoiSan communities do not have access, do not own mass media tools, not even community radio tools, actually means that the penetration of the messages, the penetration of the voices of those descending voices that is saying, please, we do not agree with A, B, and C, and we need these changes to happen, is not becoming part of the general South African discourse, because mass media penetration is the vehicle for change. It's the vehicle where you bring forward ideas. It's the vehicle where you plant the seeds in the minds of all South Africans and other world citizens, which is and that is the way how change happen. So if you do not have access to that vehicle, to a tool to actually say, this is my position, please hear me, we cannot even discuss it, because we are coming from completely opposing views on the matter. So when people are, and even South Africans, when they are only hearing one voice, when they're only hearing the voice of those that are saying, hey, KhoiSan leaders should know their place, and their place is not on the main stage in South Africa. We look at a debate around land and the land issue, and we look at the land restitution process that actually says, even though we do recognize that KhoiSan Indigenous communities are part of South Africa, they are not part of the land restitution process, because the land restitution process only affect people who lost the land after 1913. And if you think about KhoiSan that has been in South Africa when Jan van Riebeeck and all other people arrived here to colonize the country, are now being told, look, really, you cannot be part of this process. You read the media saying, these are delusional people that actually now claim that South Africa belongs to them. But we are saying, let's open the debate, let them be heard. Let all the voices be heard through mainstream media in a very objective way. Sometimes I think, and that's the second reason, that media practitioners in mass media may also lack the information, their perceptions, and the way they treat KhoiSan leaders are very condescending. The way they deal with activists are as if they are less than human, as if their causes are not important enough to be heard via the media. And when it does happen, it is more like it's stage-like. It is, and maybe the reason they see these KhoiSan activists as delusional and not really sane and bringing forward their voices in a coherent and objective manner, is because they are not informed about the history of this country, about the broader history of the world, and about the place of Indigenous people, and about UNPFII, and about other Indigenous communities in the world. So so because of their own perceptions and their own lack of knowledge around KhoiSan matters, they cannot direct discussion, they cannot direct debate. So what they do, they will recycle their own opinions and their own views. And what I've also noticed, especially in the last few few months when there's been a lot of debate around the Traditional Leaders in KhoiSan Act and the Rooibos Agreement has been that the positions brought forward, the news reports that came out would be reports that would be press releases from government. And so one wonders whether the resources mainstream media has, whether they do not feel that resources should also be used to make sure that they do research and inform themselves instead of just taking copy from government. Would it be too much to ask? In terms of what community radio is doing, and the radio station Valley FM that I represent, is that we see the need for Indigenous people's voices to be heard. We hear their feedback. We see how excited they are when they have an opportunity to actually be heard. We hear how the debates and how the discussions are being informed by the various views and opinions of the various leaders. But we, and that is the nature of community radio, we are very local, it's localized. We do use our other tools, the internet, to further the message. But but one can just imagine, should Indigenous people be part of mainstream media, be part of be just as respected and just as accepted within the mainstream media? Should there be Indigenous radios that is fully funded and well resourced, and also who has an interest in providing the views and the views of the KhoiSan people? There would be more activist movement, not only within the KhoiSan communities, but from South Africans in general. Because once we understand as a nation the position of Indigenous peoples, once we understand UNDRIP and what it means, once we understand the global acceptance there is for KhoiSan, for Indigenous peoples, we may actually have a clearer and a changed view and a changed vision as to what should happen. And that kind of activism, that kind of movement is not prevalent across South Africa. It's very vibrant within the KhoiSan communities. There's been, the past 10 years, there's been the agenda, they've set the agenda. They said we want recognition for the use of our medicine, for buhu, for rooibos, for we want recognition for our cultural heritage sites. We want recognition for our own languages. We want recognition for all aspects of our lives. We want our culture to be preserved. Those conversations, those debates, those discussions, it only penetrates government when it comes to the stage where there's need for protest action because we're not being heard. And by that I mean, should there be a development and there's big business behind that development, and KhoiSan leaders, as the case was about 2 days ago, would say, no, we do not agree with the development, then mass action would bring it to the attention to the mainstream media, not the normal discussion and debate and reporting process. It's like only the revolutionized actions are being taken in consideration and reported on, and those reports are very often very condescending. Those reports are also skewed in such a way that the leaders see.
A certain, please.
Excuse me.
Could you just certain?
What we are saying is that we would like we would like a media. We would like the media as institution not only to respond and react to KhoiSan activism when it is the type of revolutionary activism that we are marching or we are taking the country to court, as we've done recently. The KhoiSan communities, they take the representative, created changes to the electoral legislation in the country. But we are saying, we also want to be heard when we say we want the implementation of UNDRIP, we want the implementation of ILO 69. We want media to be an information and communication channel, so that there's a flow of respectful reporting between Indigenous KhoiSan activists in the country and the mainstream media. And as I said, I would just like us to reiterate that a lot of debates, discussions, policy changes are happening within South Africa that is that's crucial, like the land issues, like issues around electricity, climate change, and water, around agricultural use, the use of land, but also about culture and about language and about
Marianne,
and actually,
could you shorten, please? Could you just conclude?
excuse me?
Could you please shorten, please? Could you shorten? Could you conclude?
Okay, let me just conclude by saying thank you. Sorry, I can go on and on. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Marianne. I had to stop you in between.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I lost track of time.
And also thank you, Marianne, for highlighting the challenges in South Africa for making the indigenous voices being heard. Now from South Africa, I would like to move to Asia, and I would like to request Jagat Lama Dong to share the experiences of Nepal, mainly the media's role in ensuring the indigenous people's right to information in mother tongue. Jagat Dong is a chairperson of Indigenous Community Radio Network, a network of 24 Indigenous community radio, and he is also founder of a number of Indigenous-led community radio, as well as television and other media houses. And he has worked in media, especially in Indigenous radio and television, actively over the last 18 years. Jagat Dong, the floor is yours, please, in short.
Thank you. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. Thank you, Dave, and thank you so much for organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of Indigenous Community Radio Network. Indigenous Community Radio Network is the network or the umbrella organization of Indigenous Peoples led community radios. Currently, there are 24 members, Indigenous led community radio station, founded in the year 2017. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 16 recognized the importance of the rights of Indigenous peoples to their own forms of media and free expression in the Indigenous languages for safeguarding culture, identity, and equally to protect knowledge and information concerning to Indigenous peoples. The media can ensure Indigenous people's right to access to information, participation, and voices. But in Nepal, there are few media outlets which provide programming in Indigenous languages and from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. Nepal's media has been and is still overwhelmingly controlled by the members of the dominant social groups, not only in terms of ownership, but also in terms of content production. The major language used in the media has been Nepali. Following the 2007 democratic movement in Nepal, the government adopted liberal media policy, which helped increase the number of community radio At present, there are as many as 116 television and 793 FM radio stations which have obtained a license to operate across the country. Similarly, there are total 7,743 newspapers and magazines registered, including 735 daily newspapers. Of all newspapers published in Nepal, 93% newspapers are published in non-indigenous languages. The media in indigenous languages, newspapers, radio, and TV programs account for less than 7% of the total, despite the fact that indigenous peoples make up 36% of the national population. The government-run public media, Nepal Television, Radio Nepal, and Gorkhapatra, which is daily newspaper, provide merely translated Nepali news into some indigenous languages. Those which have a relatively higher number of indigenous languages speakers. And the content does not reflect the cultures, concerns, and voices of indigenous peoples themselves. Of the total 740 FM radio obtained for license, some 400 are termed community radio stations. These are mainly run by NGOs and cooperatives, with some being commercial, run by private companies. Although community radio stations in Nepal have the potential to be the lifeblood for many remote communities where many residents are speakers of indigenous languages, many of currently licensed community radio stations are located in district headquarters, physically inaccessible to the majority of indigenous peoples who are living in remote villages. They are mostly controlled by dominant groups in terms of ownership, decision-making, and content production. We believe that in order to truly fulfill their role as a community radio station, the communities should have meaningful participation in the radio's leadership board, and content should reflect the community's cultural and linguistic diversity. Currently, at least a few individuals or groups from indigenous communities founded indigenous radio and television, including television in Nepal. They lack funding and support from the government. To conclude, the lack of indigenous people's control over their own forms of media in indigenous languages has hindered indigenous people's right to access, participate in, and have voice in Nepali society, and deprived of their right to information, freedom of expression, reflecting their culture and lingual diversity, and right to communication in their indigenous languages. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Jagat Dong, for completing your experiences within the timeline, and also for highlighting the role that the indigenous community radio as well as indigenous community television played in Nepal. Now, from Asia, I would like to move to the United States of America in order to share the experiences of indigenous communication in the United States of America. I have Jenni Monet, and Jenni is an award-winning journalist who writes about indigenous people's rights and injustice for publications such as the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, also the Center for Investigative Reporting. And she also has covered extensively in global affairs in Al Jazeera, and also traveled throughout the indigenous world. And lately, she has founded a weekly newsletter called the Indigenously, with the theme that decolonizing your newsfeed. To share these experiences, Jenni Monet, please, the floor is yours.
Dawae Dav cultural survival, all of my fellow panelists, WACC, to all of you around the world. Jenni Monet Hiname, Koekoi, Anishinaabe Moda Hiratsira. My name is Jenni Monet. I'm a tribal citizen of Laguna, Pueblo, and a direct descendant of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And I'm speaking to you today from the indigenous homelands of the Wasco people in Oregon. Thank you so much for this time to fill the gaps of what wasn't in the study, and not by any, lack of work from Senor Ramos Rodriguez. He did a wonderful job with that study, and a lot of the United States input did not come from the US because of a lack of really my organization of getting that information to the study. And I look forward to filling those gaps in the future with the Indigenous Media Caucus. In this presentation before you right now, I can go by the prompts of Senor Ramos Rodriguez on what I know to be the present state of radio here in the United States for Indigenous media. It's actually a bright spot for our media. When we look at the greater landscape of where Indigenous media sits in the spectrum in the greater United States. So just let me begin just by giving you an introduction. In the United States, there are roughly 6.2 million Americans who identify as Indigenous, and half of those people are believed to roughly be tribal citizens, actual members of the 574 federally recognized tribes here in the United States. And another of those half are self-identifying. Either they are unable to enroll in a tribe, or they are, long descendants of tribes that are latching on to their indigeneities. And so when you look at that population, it's one that's growing more vibrant. With relationship to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, when it was adopted at the UN General Assembly, at the UN Permanent Forum, the United States was not on board in adopting the UNDRIP. In fact, it would take 3 more years before President Obama lent his support behind the UNDRIP. And it wasn't the strongest language at the time in 2010 when President Obama did initially throw support behind the UNDRIP, but it was a turn away from the resistance that the United States had before. And if you recall, there were 4 of the leading colonizing countries in the world that were resistant to the UNDRIP, and the United States, next to Canada and Australia, the United States was the last holdout. I could speak a little bit more on where we are on that timeline with the UNDRIP and Article 16 and all the other articles in a moment. With regard to radio, as I said, here in the United States, radio is a bright light in the story of Indigenous media here in the United States. We know that there are roughly 60 radio stations that are organized by the Native Public Media Organization, and the Native Public Media Organization, NPM, is working directly with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's state-sponsored funding that goes to these airwaves to set up tribal radios, not just tribal radios, community radio stations across the country. And where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting originates comes from post-civil rights era legislation in the 1950s and 60s here in the United States. If you can recall that history here in the United States, it was another tumultuous time for racial inequality being addressed here in the United States in civil rights eras, mostly around Black civil rights, and the Red Power movement certainly rode that, the Indigenous rights movement here in the United States. And what came of that was actual legislation from this Corporation for Public Broadcasting to set aside government funding, federal government funding, to build media around marginalized communities. And certainly that has gone to building a network, a really promising network of tribal radio across the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. As I said, there are 60 that are organized with under the Native public media, but there are actually a whole other group more that operate independently of that organization, NPM. I'm a little fuzzy on the numbers. I want to say maybe, anywhere from 30 to 40. It could be more than that. And so roughly you have about 100 of these tribal radio stations operating in the United States, and they're quite promising. I think that they deliver what Senor Ramos Rodriguez was telling us about the themes that are so central, I think, to Indigenous radio worldwide. Certainly language, I think, is what lives and beats at the heart of that. And certainly in addressing the UNDRIP's Article 16, the right to media in our languages, I think that is what's so essential. What was essential, and I think what was addressed before the pandemic, was that, having this kind of messaging, this kind of communication and dialogue to reach our communities that oftentimes are living in rural environments where radio is maybe the only source of information, as opposed to, say, the internet. That kind of information was always, that kind of transmission was always so important. And then when the pandemic hit in communities like the Navajo Nation, I'm thinking, who got hit hard by the pandemic, that became so much more vital to get the information that otherwise might have not been reached by a T1 line or, Wi-Fi of any kind. And so it lives at the heart, language, the preservation lives at the heart of fulfilling Article 16, but also fulfilling the goals of Indigenous radio here in the United States. And then, in a more organized effort, there's a national public radio show called Native America Calling. It's a talk radio program. It's based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's not centrally located on one tribal territory, but it is essentially a microphone for the greater network of Indigenous communities in the United States. And it's mostly thematic based on current events. And it really becomes a mouthpiece for and a gauge for seeing where the viewpoints are on various issues involving upholding sovereignty, upholding Indigenous rights, in a U.S. context, in how it relates globally, and certainly fulfilling that kind of decolonized thinking that was addressed in the report. And so those are some of the overview. Constitutionally, here in the United States, there's not an intentional directive that spells out Article 16 and its right to Indigenous media in our own language in the United States. But obviously, we do have the First Amendment, which is the right to free speech, and that fulfills the right to all Americans, including Indigenous Americans. Looking at just some of the comments that have been made here already this morning, is particularly with involving what Miriam Dicker had to say about, the scope and what needs are filled when we look at what Indigenous media fills beyond just our own tribal communities, for the greater public, filling a role of a vital source of education and information that perhaps is not getting to the greater public. That Marianne had to say that they think that the land belongs to them. That certainly is the case here in the United States. There was a study conducted sometime maybe 5 years ago that showed that in our public school systems here in the United States, roughly 90% of public school curriculum across the United States where tribes are situated, roughly 90% of those schools lack any kind of education or curriculum about Indigenous peoples. And so that invisibility factor is so extreme and so high that when you get contexts like that of, you know, a lack of education, but also the condescension that comes in when they are addressing Indigenous peoples that are still here, that's very real. In fact, we saw a recent event of that just this week. A couple of days ago, there's a conservative pundit who has a paid analyst position on CNN. As you all know, CNN is a global brand, and here in the United States, it's one of the leading cable networks in the United States. And one of their pundits, while not on CNN, went to a conservative conference over last Friday and basically made the case that you know, the United States, quote unquote, birthed a nation from nothing, and committing complete erasure of Indigenous peoples in the year 2021. And while that was not publicly broadcast in the United States, it was streamed on the internet. We do have proof that it's out there and that it could be shared, you know, far and wide. And the benefit that something like that gives us is a doorway and a real tangible example that even though Indigenous media is on a promising rise in the United States, which I'll get to in a moment, that there's still a long way to go. And I think that, you know, when we do this work on the inside, it's very easy for us to be siloed and think that the progress that we're making is the progress that everybody else is seeing. And I just think that that's not the case, that these sorts of incidents always will pop up and bring us back to why we're doing this work and the kind of progress that we still need to make. And just wrapping up here, there was something I just wanted to bring in my own experiences of where we are here in the United States. A year ago, 2 years ago, I wrote a piece for the Columbia Journalism Review called The Crisis in Covering Indian Country, which highlighted more overview of the entire media landscape, including radio. But it was pretty dismal even back then, even with the bright spot that I mentioned about public radio, which I personally believe that tribal radio here in the United States is the most best untapped resource for Indigenous media in the United States. We just have not penetrated it to the force that it can bring. But where we stand and why I say that is because when you set that against corporate media structure here in the United States and any other kind of independent media, Native people working in those spaces still largely represent roughly less than 1/2%. I mean, we're at less than 0.5% in the United States as staff journalists in newsrooms like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian. We're writing in those spaces as sometimes as journalists. Largely what's filling that gap are opinion essayists coming forward. And there's a difference. And I think that we need to recognize what that difference is because the flip side of that is that on the tribal level, we've actually seen a decrease in the number of tribally owned newspapers, which for better or worse means that there's a vacuum in those communities. And then if you look at the problems that come with tribally owned media, of which there's roughly, I want to say, I think there's maybe about 200 tribally owned newspapers, newsletters of some kind. When they're tribally owned, it does carry a sense of censorship that's at play if you're looking at this in terms of a journalistic integrity sort of framework. And so, I think that when we're talking about the purpose of Indigenous media, to preserve language, to decolonize people's news feeds, to educate and inform, those are all very important aspects of media. But there's also, I think the sophistication that also needs to be, I think, made aware when we are Indigenous peoples reporting on our own causes and issues, that there's a responsibility that comes with that in terms of also bringing and bearing truth. And obviously I'm coming at this from a journalist who's, who has wrestled in these spaces for a good while. But I think that I have, I've kind of covered what I wanted to say, and I'll yield whatever time I have remaining, but thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jenni, for bringing your communication experiences from indigenous ancestral homeland in American Southwest, especially the native nations. From USA, now I move to Latin America in order to highlight the role of different media play in bringing the indigenous voices. I would like to request David Hernández Palmar. He is the last speaker in the panel. And David Hernández is Wayuu from Venezuela. He is the filmmaker, producer, and journalist, and also a curator. He curates the International Indigenous Showcases of Venezuela and produced by the WACC, Indigenous Audiovisual Foundations of Venezuela, and the Wayuu Film and Video Showcase. And David is also a political advisor of the Latin American coordinator of Indigenous Peoples Film and Communications, which is in short known as KHLACPI. And KHLACPI also had already conducted a study on the status of indigenous media in Latin America, focusing Latin America like Caucus did. And David, I would like to request you how such a study support indigenous communications in your region. Please, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Anaya would say. Muchas gracias a las voces de las hermanas que me antecedieron y también al hermano también de México, al hermano Rodríguez Ramos, quien hizo un excelente trabajo con este estudio. Y gracias, Jenni, por el alcance que has hecho desde el territorio de Isla Tortuga. Yo quiero decir brevemente que sabemos que no se puede comprender la comunicación indígena sin antes comprender los procesos históricos, socioeconómicos y políticos de nuestros pueblos, ¿no?
Social and political histories of these.
Déjame un momentito coordinar mi interpretación, que no lo había colocado, por favor. Listo, perdón. Bueno, brevemente, entonces, un poco para el contexto, para las personas que nos están escuchando y viendo, desde la década de los 70, la mayoría de los pueblos indígenas de América Latina, o Abya Yala, pues iniciamos significativos procesos de comunicación usando las nuevas tecnologías que van desde la producción radial, el cine y el lanzamiento de portales indígenas. Esto con el objetivo de visibilizar no solamente nuestras situaciones como pueblo, sino también nuestras propuestas, ¿no? Por eso es que desde KHLACPI, una organización paraguas conformada por más de 50 organizaciones indígenas, nos preocupa la tipificación como delito el establecimiento de emisoras de radios comunitarias, por ejemplo, lo que ha conllevado a la criminalización de comunicadores indígenas en detrimento a los derechos fundamentales, a la libertad de expresión y particularmente el artículo 16 de la Declaración de los Pueblos Indígenas, del UNDRIP, ¿no? Entonces, es por eso que una de las organizaciones que conforma KHLACPI, que se llama Proyecto Videastas de la Frontera Sur de México, fueron quienes se encargaron de sistematizar este estudio o este reporte. El reporte se llama Situación del Derecho a la Comunicación con énfasis en los y las comunicadoras indígenas de América Latina. También la población negra, la población afrodescendiente está incluida en este reporte. No abarcamos todos los países, pero sí quisiera mencionar que este reporte o este libro que ya está publicado como un libro tiene 3 partes y 10 apartados. Una parte dice o trata de explicar la forma de la comprensión de la comunicación en los pueblos y en especial la comunicación ancestral indígena frente a las concepciones modernas de la comunicación. La otra parte habla sobre algunos convenios internacionales relativos al derecho a la libre expresión. Ahí hablamos sobre la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos de la ONU del año 1948. Hablamos sobre la Convención Americana de los Derechos Humanos de 1976, el Convenio 169 de la OIT, conocido por muchos de los pueblos indígenas. Y también la tercera parte de este informe es sobre las violaciones de los derechos de los comunicadores indígenas y negros de la América Latina. Ahora, solamente voy a mencionar los apartados, ¿no? Los apartados tienen que ver con la comunicación desde la cosmovivencia o los modos de vivir a partir de la cosmovisión de los comunicadores indígenas y negros. Las declaraciones, convenios, acuerdos y pactos internacionales. Las constituciones, leyes y reglamentos nacionales por los países por los cuales se hizo el estudio. Y bueno, en el libro que está disponible gratis en línea. De hecho, vamos a ponerlo también en la página del Caucus Global de Comunicación Indígena, tanto el estudio como también la participación o la presentación de este estudio ante el Consejo de Derechos Humanos en Ginebra, en el marco del mecanismo de expertos de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Y bueno, los países con los que se hicieron este estudio fueron Chile, Brasil, Venezuela, Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, y Guatemala, Honduras. Se habla sobre la distribución equitativa de las frecuencias, no se dice si realmente los pueblos indígenas participan de la torta, la distribución del espectro radial. También está El Salvador. Y bueno, un poco también se habla de las violaciones a los derechos de los derechos a la comunicación. ¿Quiénes son los agresores de los derechos de los comunicadores indígenas? Se identificaron gobiernos, políticos, grupos de poder económico, el narcotráfico, el crimen organizado y las pandillas, ¿no? También, bueno, mencionar también que para nosotros era importante comparar cómo los periodistas que sí están graduados de una universidad sí tenían ciertos derechos que a los comunicadores populares indígenas no les reconocían, porque como es un ejercicio ejercido desde su necesidad de comunicar y por no haber pasado por una universidad no era tan legítimo como un periodista, ¿no? Entonces había esa necesidad también de visibilizar esa discriminación que hay del derecho que tenemos como pueblos de ejercer la comunicación. Otra cosa que quería mencionar con respecto a esto es que hay veces que nosotros tomamos el ejercicio de la comunicación como algo, como un derecho, pero también es como una estrategia de vida, ¿no? Y las comunicadoras y los comunicadores están como dispuestos a que su vida sea sembrada para dar más frutos de historias. Hay gente que es asesinada, y de hecho acá mismo donde yo vivo en Colombia, en el Huila, donde yo vivo, nuestros vecinos del pueblo indígena Nasa, de hecho en estos momentos hay paro nacional acá en Colombia, a propósito de una serie de violaciones de derechos humanos que tienen que ver con los pueblos indígenas y la población en general. En todo caso, nosotros recomendamos a partir de este estudio que los estados reconozcan en sus legislaciones a los medios de información comunitarios, incluyendo medidas de promoción de las creaciones de la promoción de los frutos comunicacionales indígenas. Pero también recomendamos que se adopten medidas efectivas para hacer valer el derecho de los pueblos indígenas a tener sus propios medios de comunicación. Y también recomendamos medidas de urgencia para proteger los derechos de los comunicadores criminalizados o en riesgo por motivo del ejercicio de la comunicación. La otra reflexión de este reporte es que muchos de los procesos indígenas de comunicación en Abya Yala, por las urgencias, a veces no tienen el tiempo de sistematizar su experiencia. Y como no está sistematizado, no hay datos que podemos referir, que podemos citar, que podemos referenciar. Y eso es importante para decir, son tantos indígenas en este año que han sido acusados o criminalizados por instalar una radio comunitaria, ¿no? Colombia es el país que más en todo caso, Colombia tiene a las organizaciones que más han sistematizado esos casos de violación de derechos. Los otros países todavía carecemos de esa posibilidad de sistematizar esos datos, ¿no? Entonces, un poco la reflexión que hace este informe no solamente es decir cuántas leyes hay o cuántos casos de violaciones de derechos hay, sino también la necesidad que tenemos como pueblos indígenas de poder documentar por nuestras propias referencias los casos y llevarlos en formato de datos, estadísticas, para poder hacer visible nuestras demandas. Y por último, reitero que este reporte, así como la recomendación entre el mecanismo de expertos de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en Ginebra, estará disponible en la página del Caucus Global de Comunicación Indígena. Y decirles que estamos disponibles a la orden para seguir tejiendo este intercambio necesario que hay entre pueblos indígenas que somos. Porque como pueblos tenemos el derecho de determinar los términos en cómo queremos relacionarnos con otros pueblos. Allí entonces determinamos nuestra autonomía, determinamos nuestra identidad y determinamos nuestro derecho a ejercer la comunicación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, David, as well as all the panelists for sharing and bringing your communication experiences through different angles. And I would like to request all the panelists to put your video on before ending the event to take a group picture and share in the social medias. And we have now almost 18 minutes left for the allotted time. And we have so many questions in the chat box. And I would like to read out at least two questions, the major questions that I have collected from the chat, though there are many. So I would like to request panelists to answer who wish to give answer. The first question is, according to the concept of Article 16 of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNPFII, what is the practice of recognizing indigenous media differently by the countries? Or the question is, can you tell us about the practice of other countries? Basically, what is the practice of recognizing indigenous media in different countries? This is the first question is. The second is, the second question is, what does indigenous radio need to tap into its full potential? So how we can use the community radio or indigenous radio to amplify the voices. And these are the two questions. And as we have lesser time, so I would like to request any one panelist to give answer. I cannot give a time to all the panelists who want to give.
Sí, yo voy a decir algo brevemente. Yo creo que la oportunidad histórica de poder decir que estamos vivos frente a la crisis climática y en tiempos de pandemia es que hemos podido, como tal vez forzosamente, de encontrarnos en el mundo digital. Pero además como los pueblos indígenas son profundamente auditivos, ¿no? Disfrutan mucho de distintas entregas radiales. Hay la posibilidad también de que podamos explorar los podcasts o las pequeñas cosas que la gente se pasa por WhatsApp o todo esto, y eso ha funcionado mucho en nuestro pueblo, en el pueblo Wayuu, como para poder, poder la gente como compartirse el audio, ¿no? Hay veces que a lo mejor no pueden de pronto sintonizar una emisora o una estación radial. Yo creo que en todo caso la situación de la legalidad de las emisoras comunitarias indígenas es un caso todavía sin resolver, es algo que necesitamos de mucho más lobby, de mucho más incidencia en el seno de las Naciones Unidas y también de otras instancias, porque por más que nosotros tengamos la licencia, falta un tema también de la sostenibilidad que programo yo para poder tener entrada, ¿no? Entonces hay veces que cuando le dan la licencia comunitaria a una emisora, se supone que no puede contratar publicidad, entonces dicen, pero ¿y entonces de qué vamos a vivir en esta emisora? ¿No? Entonces creo que esa es la parte que todavía creo que hay que seguir luchando, un poco lo que quería como mencionar, dos cosas. Eso, el estatus legal de una emisora que es comunitaria, pero que su nombre comunitario le quita la posibilidad de poder ser sostenible al momento de vender publicidad. Y dos, la posibilidad que hay con los podcasts de poder pasarse por los teléfonos los mensajes. Eso vería yo. Gracias.
Jenni, you were just saying that there is a brighter side about the community radios in the US. If you can answer within a minute or two.
Oh, Adoe, thank you, Dev. Yes, I'll be very brief. I think, to respond to what Indigenous radio needs here in the United States and also in relationship to Article 16, the two really haven't coalesced in their mission, I think, to amplify Indigenous radio. And I think that if you had a more collective response with the network of Indigenous radio here in the United States to own Article 16, that right as a right for Indigenous radio, Indigenous media to amplify Indigenous voices, particularly in our own languages, I think that that starts to carry a different kind of tone and emergency to the issue, because we all know our Indigenous languages, have been so endangered for so long. And I think that if we make it a cause, approach here in the United States, I can't speak to other places around the country, but particularly here in the United States, I think that that would really carry Indigenous radio and its wider network as a cohesive group, a little bit more forward with one cause moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Jenni. Ramos, Jose Manuel, you would like to share? You raise the hand.
Sí.
With a minute, please. Yeah.
A mí me gustaría agregar a lo que se ha dicho, pues insistir, enfatizar en la necesidad de que las radios logren mayor autonomía desde el punto de vista tecnológico. Esto es muy importante, poder, digamos, entender que en la tecnología también hay una cuestión política inmersa. Entonces, por ejemplo, acercarnos a los programas de software libre, al movimiento de software libre, desarrollar las propias habilidades tecnológicas. Esto, por ejemplo, para las agencias que apoyan a la radio comunitaria indígena, pues pensamos que deberían enfatizar en preparar en los aspectos técnicos para dejar de depender, porque siempre se cae en una dependencia hacia los prestadores de servicios en el campo de la tecnología. Entonces, agrego lo que ya se ha dicho, agrego que hay que trabajar mucho en lograr esta independencia, esta autonomía desde el punto de vista tecnológico. Es todo.
Thank you, Jose Manuel, also David and Jenni for answering. Though we have a bunch of questions which have been sent in our mailbox or through different social medias. Because of shortage of time, I think I cannot allot extra time. And as we have come to the close to the session, I would like to request Lorenzo Vargas, one of the organizers of this event, to give some concluding remarks. Lorenzo?
Thanks so much, Dev, and thanks so much to all the panelists, to Jenni, to Jagat, to Marianne, and of course to Jose Manuel as the author of the study. And let me see if I'm forgetting anybody. And of course to David from Venezuela. Hola, David, muchas gracias. I just wanted to thank all of you for your presence. I'm with the World Association for Christian Communication, WACC, and along with Cultural Survival and the Indigenous Media Caucus, we're very happy to be part of this long-term process to democratize media, to give an opportunity to enable Indigenous peoples to have their voice, because they already have a voice, they just don't have the platforms. So it's not so much about giving voice to the voiceless, but rather to create the structures where all voices are heard, and to highlight just how important it is to find a way to promote media, the democratization of media, in order to advance Indigenous rights. They're absolutely tied, in the same way that we're saying Indigenous people should be in control of their natural resources, of their lands. That also entails being in control of their own media and their own voices and their own narratives. So I'd like to end by thanking everybody and inviting all the attendees to keep in touch, so we can continue to be part of this movement together.
Thank you, Lorenzo. On behalf of organizers, Indigenous Media Caucus, WACC, and Cultural Survival, I would like to thank all the panelists and the participants for actively participating in this event. And please stay safe and healthy during this pandemic. For regular updates, please also keep visiting the website waccglobal.org, culturalsurvival.org, and indigenousmediacaucus.org. And I would like to request everyone who are involved in communications or Indigenous media, not only follow Indigenous Media Caucus website, but also get in touch with us and involved in this global advocacy. And thank you all for your contributions. And I would like to request all the panelists to stay, keep your video on, and we take a picture. And thank you so much all. Namaste, Jeredum. I would like to stop here, and I would like to declare that the session is over now. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.